tiny babe could be carried in one arm, head cradled in hand, feet reaching towards the bend in her elbow. She looked on him with love and wonder. Each of his brothers before him had faltered that he would live. She could see it in his balled-up fists and feel it in the kick of his little heels. Though she had every faith, a little insurance never hurt. Swaddling the baby in clean cloth, she set out for the river. Her name was Thetis, and her husband had traveled with Jason and sought the golden fleece. Though she loved the newborn completely, to anyone else he was nothing special, at least not yet. But this is an old, old story, and we still know his name, and we still celebrate his strength, and sometimes we even feel his pain. Achilles became a fearless hero, facing every battle confident in the story of his mother's journey to the riverbank, and how she held him by the heel and lowered him into the river Styx, assuring invulnerability every place the water touched. I have heard this story in two different ways. One is that she needed to hold the child somehow to keep him from being lost to the river, and where her hand gripped his heel, the water did not protect. But the other story is that his father, Peleus, fearing for his child's life, followed Thetis to the river. Not understanding her intentions and knowing nothing of the ritual, he interrupted the process, thinking that he was saving his son from drowning. But instead, by interrupting, he created a weak spot in the undipped heel that would one day be the boy's undoing. After a lifetime of victory, an arrow found the one spot not touched by the water, and that arrow killed him. I wonder at stories like this that last so long in our imaginations. I think they must somehow speak to the eternal in our humanity, or else they would have faded into memory. But even those stories that remain are subtly changed in quiet, small ways. Take the river Styx, for example. This was the river that separated the land of the dead from the land of the living. It might be easy for those of us who live with water coming only from the tap in the sky to think the river tame. But for those who first told the story, for those who were older than any writer whose words we read, for those who lived closer to the land, the river was wild and alive. There were spirits of place, and there was power in the elements of nature. A river that flowed between the living and the dead was more than just water. It was a place between life and death, an unknown place which no one could cross without a guide. I want to think of that river as liminal space, a place of threshold where we become something new. Liminal places and seasons can make us feel unbalanced, like what we thought we knew has all gone away and we are having to live into a new way of being. In our story, Achilles does not cross the river, but he enters it and he returns stronger than before. The season we are in right now has been described as a liminal season. It is a season of unlearning and relearning, a season of fear right up against great hope. We are wearing masks because we fear the air we breathe will make someone else sick. We are calling our politicians and putting out yard signs and protesting in our cities and doing what we can because more and more of us understand that systemic racism is killing Black people in America. And in the strangest of seasons, people still get up in the morning and brew a cup of tea. They stir in honey, they squeeze a slice of lemon, they wash the dishes and make their beds. They still fall in love. They still seek and find ways to connect. We still care for one another. We still learn and grow, even when the learning is painful, even though growth sometimes hurts. The truth is, everything we do risks hurting at least a little, and sometimes a lot. We are entering the river and returning to life stronger, more aware of ourselves and our environment. Living with uncertainty changes us. I remember being in Selma, Alabama with a group of Unitarian Universalists many years ago. We were there to listen to the people who had fought so hard for equality and justice in the civil rights movement. We were there with a woman named Joanne Bland, who was a little bitty girl when they marched across the Edmund Pettus Bridge. She told how she was beaten to unconsciousness in that first march. But with her family standing beside her, marching beside her, and sometimes carrying her, she found her way home. And then she told how the very next morning her grandmother woke her up and told her to get dressed. It was time again to go protest for their right to vote. I imagine she was still sore from the beating the day before. I imagine she was afraid. I imagine she trusted her grandmother. And I am thankful that she shares her story so honestly. She said there were times when she did not want whatever freedom they were marching for. It was too costly. But for the sake of people she loved and respected, she got up again and kept marching, having faith but not knowing what the outcome would be. They were met with violence, and they retreated. They returned, and returned again until they were allowed to march for the rights which should have already been guaranteed. And in their marching, through their marching, we were all made a little stronger. I like to think the Voting Rights Act passed because of 11-year-old Joanne Bland, and also some grown-ups like Martin Luther King Jr. But her presence and her story reveals a complexity behind the victory, a humanity giving rise to justice. And I think maybe it isn't an accident that the story of strength and freedom happens on a bridge crossing a river. After all, didn't Moses part the Red Sea to lead his people to freedom? All these years later, we tell the story of how emerging from the river, parting the sea, crossing a bridge fraught with peril, and how making that journey made people stronger. Now let me push this idea of rivers and liminal space just a little further, if you'll stay with me. There is a way to understand the life of Jesus as having changed when he was baptized in the river. It was then that God chose to be with him in a way that was different from anyone else at any time before. In this understanding, Jesus is still human, special, very, very special, but human and not divine, still not God. So many people who need Jesus to be God really need God to have become Jesus. They need for God to have met power and vulnerability not at the river, but in the primal waters of amniotic fluid. So, if we who are human and oh so vulnerable seek strength and protection from harm, wouldn't it follow that God, who is oh so powerful, seek vulnerability through experiencing the human? The divine and the human meet in paradox, in miracle, in liminal space, in waters of baptism and protection, in bridges where human dignity triumphs over human cruelty. And what are we who are trying to stay safe from sickness, who are trying to realize the promise of America, who are trying to free the world of racism and be good to each other. What are we supposed to do in these strange times? Right now, it feels like many of the things we thought we knew are no longer true. Even as we are losing what we knew, we are learning new things. This is a time of transition. So I invite you to think about other transitions in your life. Many of us have been heartbroken. Do you remember feeling like you were drowning in sadness and sorrow and anger? Did any of you make big, giant promises like, I will never fall in love again? Maybe that was just me. Or maybe you voted with great hope in an election that you were sure was going to change things for the better, and that whole election went badly sideways. And maybe you're tempted to self-silence your voting voice out of despair or cynicism. Or maybe you tried a new job or a hobby or a sport that you really had great enthusiasm for, but you don't feel like you did as well as you could have. Maybe you felt embarrassed or less than successful. Life is full of all these risks, all these in-between spaces where we are so very uncomfortable. But if liminal space is where the vulnerable meets the powerful, maybe it's where the human meets the divine. We enter the space to understand what is divine in us and what is divine in us now. Human dignity, expansive compassion, active care for one another and for the health of strangers. Activism for everyone's human rights. And when we learn to be more comfortable living in between, we become more resilient, more kind. And in that becoming, we grow closer to the holy. That's all. So may it be. Amen.